everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Ask a Political Scientist. My name is Andrea Jones-Rooy, and I am so thrilled that you are here with us to talk about political science today. For those of you who don't know me, I am a political scientist and a comedian, and the main thing I want to talk about is that I love political science, and I hope that through this show, if you don't already love political science, you too will come to love it. And if you already love political science, then join me in celebrating, I guess. But thank you so much for being here. As a reminder, we are very proud to be a founding member of the World's Smartest Podcast Network. Check out our partner podcasts if you haven't already: The Political Orphanage with Andrew Heaton and Lost in America with Turner Sparks and Michael Ira Kaplan. Today is October 15th. Again, I do these shows mainly to keep track of what day it is. It is October 15th. We are here today to talk about, of course, a very broad topic: race and politics. We are going to talk to one of the foremost experts on this very broad topic and ask questions like, how do race and racism influence politics? I'm actually going to also ask about how politics influences racial identity and racism. And I want to talk about how we're going to make progress towards racial justice, both through a research perspective and some input from the practitioner side of things. Our political scientist guest tonight, we are so excited to welcome him to the show. We have Vincent Hutchings, who is a professor at the University of Michigan. Those of you who have been watching this show know that there is a very strong pro-Michigan bias on this show, and I stand by it. But I will say that we actually don't that often get real live Michigan faculty. It's a lot of Michigan alumni, because this is also a complicated way for me to hang out with my friends. But Vince is a professor at the University of Michigan. He is a fantastic professor. In fact, he was recently named the Diversity and Social Transformation Professor at the University of Michigan, which is a very big deal. He is also the Haynes Walton Jr. Collegiate Professor of Political Science and Afro-American and African Studies. Sadly, Vince was not my professor. I don't think I ever took a class with Vince, but I was a grader for one of his courses, and I learned more in that course than I did in other courses that will remain unnamed. So Vince is awesome. We are also excited to welcome, during the second half of the show, we are going to have Chinesha Scott joining us. She is a million amazing things. I will just name a few. She is a writer, a producer, a director, a performer, an artist, an activist, a community organizer, and she is a real life candidate for office. And so we are going to be talking about all of those things. And I also just want to flag, I stalked her really hard on Instagram, and this picture is amazing. And I'm very jealous of her the political company that she keeps. So we were very excited to welcome Chinesha to the show in the second half. Every week, in addition to doing this show for free, we also invite anyone who is able to donate any amount that you like in lieu of tickets, if you can. I know it's a rough time economically for many, so absolutely no expectation. But if you are able to, this week, we are very proud to be raising money for the Equal Justice Initiative, which works towards ending mass incarceration and excessive punishment in the U.S., challenges racial and economic injustice, and protects basic human rights for the most vulnerable people, which is a pretty good cause as far as I can tell. So you can send anything you like. No amount is too small or too big, to paypal.me/AskAPS. There's also a link in the comments, in the description underneath this video, so you can just click on that as well. So yeah, thanks in advance for that. Here is how our hour is going to go today. We're going to talk with Vince first about research on race in political science, including how does race influence politics and how do politics influence our attitudes about race. Then we will welcome Chinesha to the show, and we're going to talk together about how we can make progress towards racial justice. I will also demand that she tells me what it's like to run for office. And then we will finally take your questions. So please be sending in questions over the live chat as you have them, and we will fold as many as we can in at the end. All right, so that is the plan for today. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Vince Hutchings. Vince, welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you, Andrea. I'm happy to be here.
How are you doing?
Pretty good under the circumstances, and health. Obviously, there's a lot of health challenges people are encountering, and my family and I have been fortunate not to have to worry about that so far.
Good. Well, I'm glad to hear it, and thank you for adding to what I imagine are already a lot of Zoom and Zoom-esque commitments on your calendar to join us tonight. So happy to have you here. Yes, yeah. Very, very well. Screens it is. So, Vince, I want to talk, before we dive into some of the more detailed questions about the relationship between race, racial attitudes, and politics, I want to ask you if you could share generally How have political scientists thought about race? And I'll leave it to you whether we want to just limit to the context of the subfield of American politics or generally the role that political scientists, how they've incorporated race into research generally over time in this field.
Well, I mean, it's a great question, and it's a big question.
Yeah.
The short answer is that over the life of the discipline, the science, uh, political science is only maybe 130, 35 years old. So for most of the history of the discipline, they haven't thought about race at all. And it's only really been in the last 50 years or so that there has been a concerted effort to try to address these questions. But even now, including up to the current era, it really remains on the margins of the profession. So I don't think this is what you were exactly getting at, but the reality is that the discipline doesn't think about race very much at all. It's not a central concept in the study of political science, and even in the study of American politics. And it's a bit surprising, given that you could argue it's perhaps the central organizing concept in American history.
Right. And I want to ask, why is this the case? I suspect the answer is something like racism, but perhaps we could add more nuance to that. I mean, are you optimistic that we'll start to include it more, especially in light of a lot of the conversations we're having nationally this year, or do you think we're in for more of the same?
Well, the country is certainly going through something unusual at the moment, and I'm not referring just to the pandemic, of course, but to the demonstrations following the killing of George Floyd. So and this may well have an impact on the profession. So the profession is not immune from what's going on in the real world. Certainly, it remains to be seen. But and there certainly has been progress. I don't want my comments to be construed as saying that there aren't many excellent scholars out there studying questions of race or ethnicity across multiple subfields within political science. That is true. I was only making a more broader point about the history of the profession and even about the central role that race plays today. So I'll just say this and conclude for the moment, at least. I mean, I think the Modo Political Science department in the country has no one on the faculty who focuses on questions of race or ethnicity. So that's what I mean when I say it's not central. There is no political science department that doesn't talk about Congress. And appropriately so. It's obviously arguably the most important institution in our government, since it's part of Article 1. But there are plenty of political science departments that have no one who specializes in race.
Right. And I noticed that, yeah, it's completely striking to not have someone who studies Congress. But you're right that many departments don't particularly, many eyebrows have not been raised, let's say, for departments that do not consider race. So when political scientists do think about race, and let's say in the context of American politics, are we thinking about the influence of racial identities on our political beliefs, attitudes, behaviors? Is it about, I know your research focuses on something called racial attitudes. Where is the discipline generally thinking when we do think about race?
Well, good question. So for the most part, there have kind of been two streams of research in this area, at least in the study of American politics, which is the kind of work that I do and where my work falls. That is to say, there has been work on the perspectives and the attitudes that white Americans have about racial minorities, oftentimes African Americans, but increasingly now also about Latinos, as well as, for example, Muslim Americans, Asian Americans, et cetera. So that is one of the earliest longstanding research streams in political science that focuses on race. It's essentially how whites view racial minority groups.
So so we're saying, oh, we better pay attention to race and ethnicity. Okay, great. What do white people think about race and ethnicity? Is that
that's
truly
true.
what's going on?
I've contributed to that literature myself, so I don't want to.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think that it's understandable. It's hard for folks, especially I think now in 2020, to come to grips with the fact that, say, prior to 1970, 72, thereabouts, 90% of the American electorate was non-Hispanic white. Mm-hmm. So the notion that researchers focused on the attitudes that whites had about non-whites and most of those non-whites were African American at that time. It's understandable given the demographics. So I am being responsive to your question. I'm not for the moment making any criticisms. I can make some if you want me to or push me, but for the moment I'm mostly being descriptive in saying that there was a stream of research that focused on white attitudes about blacks and some other racial minority groups. And then the second stream, very quickly, Andrea, is that increasingly scholars, initially African Americans, but then later Latinos and Asian American scholars and others, Muslim American scholars, began to focus on the perspectives and the politics peculiar to those respective minority groups. Mm-hmm. So those are the two streams that currently exist.
Okay. And I definitely see why the focus would have been where it was at the time that you were describing. I think I see that. So I want to think about the directional influence of racial identity and racial attitudes on politics first, and then we'll think about it the other way around. Let's start first with this idea of racial attitudes. So that's something that, I mean, American politics is not my subfield, but when I read about the research such as yours about race, racial attitudes is kind of one of the most common terms that I encounter. What is a racial attitude? Is it different from racism? How does it fit in?
That is a really excellent point, and it gets at the core of what much of the literature focuses on here. I think so, and obviously a simplistic answer is that a racial attitude is an attitude about race, but of course that begs the question, what is race? Mm-hmm. And then the excellent follow-up that you had about what is racism. It's an hour show, so I don't have as much time to go into this as I think I might want to, but I'll say briefly that so race is just an arbitrary way in which we divide up the human family. It's arbitrary because it doesn't have any biological meaning. It roughly corresponds to where people, their ancestry comes from in a geographic sense. But the peculiar way we discuss this concept of race in the United States is actually particular to this country. It doesn't translate to other places in the same way. So race is a social phenomenon, but it is a meaningful social phenomenon. To say it's a social phenomenon is not to say that it's not important. It's critically important because we organize our lives, our social, economic, political lives around this admittedly made up thing, but it is nevertheless important. So the attitudes that people have about that concept, the way in which we divide the human family, is what is meant by race. Racism is a far more thorny question. That's partly what I was joking about a moment ago. The brief response to the question is that it is a reference to a system that is designed to kind of reify or to kind of prioritize a way of organizing the distribution of rights and resources based on race, such that some quote unquote racial groups have more access to resources and rights than do others. In short, it's a way of solidifying a racial hierarchy.
Mm-hmm. And then a racial attitude, is that a nicer way is that a more neutral, I guess, take on our social attitudes about different racial and ethnic groups?
So one can have an attitude about a racially defined population without one subscribing to what might be crudely described as the tenets of racism. Mm-hmm. Racism is a belief system that advocates on behalf of racial hierarchy. But if one has an attitude that racial groups are all equal, that is a racial attitude, but it isn't an attitude that lends itself to hierarchy. So the aim is to see whether individual citizens' attitudes about race influences how they behave in the political world. That's what the study of racial attitudes does. But to say that people are motivated by attitudes about race is not to conclude that they are motivated by racism. And I'll say quickly here too, because it's a bit of a pet peeve of mine. Racism cannot be reduced to racial animus. It isn't simply. It's easy to think of it as the hooded Klansman or the individual with the swastika on his arm, but that's actually not the manifestation of racism that's most consequential for most people in this country. There are certainly people in this country who adhere to those philosophies, but they represent a tiny fringe. The problem in this country with respect to race is not because of hooded Klansmen and because of Nazis. which is, of course, not my effort to endorse either of those philosophies. But the
Right.
point is that there are people who would not regard their philosophies as at all overlapping with those individuals, yet they buy into and adhere to attitudes about race that are far more likely to solidify a racial hierarchy than the person who shouts racial slurs.
Hmm. Do you have, so for example, I'm thinking of a few, but I'm curious to hear from you. What are some examples of these sorts of falling short of Klansmen, but very, very, very harmful attitudes that folks have?
Well, the belief simply that everyone can succeed in society if they simply work hard enough, and then by implication, if one hasn't succeeded, it must therefore mean that they haven't worked hard enough.
Mm.
I didn't even use the word race or any racial nouns in that little description, but that belief system, which can be adhered to for perfectly um, innocent, so to speak, reasons. One wants to believe in a system of meritocracy, I suppose. But given the very unequal distribution of resources and power and the legacy of discrimination in this country, that seemingly innocuous belief, we all, everybody works hard can succeed, has the effect of justifying racial inequality. So it doesn't require you to believe that some racial groups are biologically inferior. It doesn't require you to adhere to some master race philosophy. It's just the notion that why can't we all just live based on this notion of meritocracy? It's hard for that philosophy to be an engine of social progress in a world in which there is so much inequality that is a legacy of past actions and behavior. One quick example just to illustrate this point. So I'm doing a research project with some graduate students of mine examining perceptions of the racial wealth gap in this country.
Mm.
So in light of the George Floyd killing, many people are hearing about this in a way they perhaps haven't heard about before. But there is a very massive wealth gap, racial wealth gap in this country that translates in the following way. For the average or median white family in this country, for every dollar of wealth that they possess, the median Black and Hispanic families have about a dime.
A
So
dime.
there is
Wow.
a 10-to-1 ratio. And one last point on this, without engaging in a filibuster here, is just to
No,
say, talk about
important
political
filibuster.
science,
How about
right?
that? Yeah.
Yeah. The average African American person who has graduated from college has less family wealth than the average white person who dropped out of high school. So that is and the reason that that is true is because wealth, unlike income, wealth survives across generations.
Mm-hmm.
And so even if I could wave a magic wand and remove racial animus from this country in its entirety tomorrow, the level of racial inequality would still be dramatic, precisely because of all the legacies of discrimination that have occurred generations in the past. And this is the sort of thing that I was getting at before, Andrea. So everyone's happy to say, oh, you can't go around using the N-word. And, oh, my God, it's horrible to talk about biologically inferior and superior races. And, of course, those things are true. But then if you say, well, that success that you've acquired is because your grandparents were able to live in a neighborhood that my grandparents weren't able to live in. Well, then people start to get a little squeamish.
Mm-hmm. Right. And it's seen as, oh, you're saying that I didn't earn what I have, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, well, yeah, it is what
That's
I'm
actually
saying.
that is what
Yeah,
I'm. Yes.
precisely it. Yes, yes. So, so measuring attitudes and measurement generally through things like surveys is something that you do very well, that Michigan in general does very well. How do you go about finding out what somebody's racial attitude is? And I'm especially curious because as you're describing this, I'm thinking of, I'll speak on behalf of myself. A lot of white folks who think that they are not racist, but may harbor, these types of racial attitudes that are harmful, right? And so presumably just asking someone, hey, do you think the races are equal is not actually going to get you to their actual underlying racial attitude.
Yeah, that's true. There is something to that. There's this notion of what's known as social desirability. Some fraction of the population is reluctant to reveal their true attitudes, not just on matters of race, but religion or gender or others, socially controversial areas. And so they might give you an answer that might be defensible and morally acceptable, but not their genuine position. So that's one issue that survey researchers confront. No, there's no doubt about that. But it's worth noting. So it is a thing. Social desirability is a real thing, but folks like you and I who operate in a particular social milieu have this notion that everybody operates in a comparable world. But of course they don't. There are 300 plus million people in this country. And for many of them, expressions of what would be really uncomfortable racial intolerance are completely normative because the world in which they live does not make this a forbidden kind of position to adopt. So having said that, the point is that you would be surprised by how many Americans, if you simply ask them, can you just rate, for one of the traditional questions we ask on the American National Election Study, which is a survey we do at the University of Michigan, is, and we've been doing this for like 30 years now, could you just place these racial groups on a scale of 1 to 7 in terms of tend to be intelligent and tend to be unintelligent, or tend to be lazy, or tend to be hardworking? And you would think, oh my God, is anyone possibly going to say one group is less hardworking than another? I can assure you that the majority of white Americans throughout most of the history of the study were more than happy to say that whites are more hardworking than blacks.
Ooh. And that's with social desirability bias. So is it getting better over time?
Some. Okay. But let's not break out the champagne just yet.
I'll keep it in the fridge. Let me know when we can break it out. I'll invite you back on the show and we'll all celebrate. So how does one's racial attitudes influence their politics? I am thinking in very broad terms, people who are probably, more likely to indicate to some of these problematic responses, have certain political beliefs that I have sort of stereotypes around. I mean, is it typically left versus right, the way our attitudes drive us, or how do our attitudes shape the rest of our political thinking?
Well, there's a big controversy about that, Andrea, and so it's not an easy answer. So some would argue that it's a function of levels of intolerance, which is the traditional way people think of racism, although I've tried to make the case here this evening that that's a little too narrow. But others would say it's about a desire to preserve the privileges of the in-group. That is to say, one could this is getting back to the point I was making before about the transmission of wealth over generations, or about moving into particular neighborhoods. There are plenty of liberal democratic whites who obviously recoil at the kind of racially, let's just call it suspect language that is used by members of the Trump administration, most especially Trump himself. So there are a number of white liberal Democrats who recoil at that, but who at the same time would have a problem with allowing low-income housing in their neighborhood, who might be a little put off by the notion of affirmative action in higher education, particularly if they have kids who are about to go off to college. So let's not confuse one being uncomfortable with racially intolerant language. Let's not confuse that with wanting to preserve racial privileges.
This is hopefully an overstatement, but are there any white people who have okay racial attitudes? Because I'm feeling very, very depressed about.
Oh, absolutely. And of course, buying into systems of racial inequality is not about one's biology. So there are more than a few people of color who also buy into those systems. Just because you have a certain amount of melanin in your skin, it doesn't make you immune to this system of racism. So that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, yes, there are absolutely. And there have been historically throughout American history. One of my former students, Jennifer Chudy, who is now a professor at Wellesley, has wrote her dissertation and now writing a book on the concept of racial sympathy. So there are certainly, this is in effect the whites who worked on behalf of the abolition movement before the Civil War, or the whites who went down and worked on behalf of the civil rights movement in Mississippi and elsewhere. And maybe now the whites who are protesting on behalf of racial justice as a consequence of the George Floyd killing. So I am not sitting here, and I'm not the kind of person who would say that whites are all inherently racist, however one defines that term.
Mm.
Um, but it is the case. I will. But having said that, I will also be quick to add that it's one thing to protest on behalf of racial justice, either during the antebellum period or the civil rights movement or the current era. It's one thing to do that, which is to say, let's pursue racial justice over there.
Mhm.
And it's another thing to say, oh, and I'm okay with giving up some of my privileges to
Right.
address current racial inequity.
Right.
That's there's a lot of support for the former, but there starts to be dwindling support for the latter.
Right. I think, yeah, I'm thinking of I guess maybe it's an econ term, revealed preferences come to mind when it really push comes to shove. And look at me, I've now made this about white people again. So I also want to flag for audience members, we had Jennifer Chudy on the show
Hmm.
back in July. And so you can watch my interview with her and indeed hear more about her great research on racial sympathy. So I'm glad you mentioned, didn't think I would ever say this. This is a nonpartisan show, but I will flag. I'm glad you mentioned the Trump administration because I want to ask you, how do politicians, campaign messages, political messages generally make us think in terms of these either heighten our racial attitudes or the salience of our racial attitudes, or maybe even think in terms of these in-group, out-group types of dynamics that you described? Can politics influence our thinking about race?
Yes, I think both within the domain of race and outside of the domain of race, we are, many of us, all influenced by the actions and comments of political leaders. It can give us, not so much make us think what we weren't predisposed to think otherwise, although sometimes that happens, but it's more likely that they give us license to do the sorts of things we were already inclined to think, but perhaps
Mhm.
reluctant to do so because we didn't have a sense that there were others out there who supported us. So um, when politicians take positions that appear to give credence to adopting, positions that might be interpreted as racially intolerant, then that can promote that kind of behavior. Um, this has been true throughout American history. I'm not focusing on any particular administration, but it is the sort of thing that leaders, either at the national or local or state level, they can foster more racial division by the kind of rhetoric that they espouse. And similarly, they can, to some degree, at least curtail that division by adopting particular policies and particular stances in terms of their rhetoric.
Do you have a sense of why campaigns do this? Is it to mobilize your base? Is it really a strategy, or is it a reflection of the person sending out the message and just their beliefs? I mean, or is this like a deliberate strategy that campaigns use?
The short answer, Andrea, is that campaigns do it because it works.
Mhm.
Because this is a very heavily racially divided society. We'd like to think we would be wrong in this regard, but we would like to think that we solved all those problems back in the 1960s. But hopefully, if this past summer has shown us anything, is that those problems have not gone away. And I already mentioned the racial wealth gap. I'm not talking about the 1850s or the 1950s. I'm talking about 2020. And so it is because we have such a racially divided society and that it maps onto our political party system in the sense that um, the we often hear about how African Americans are lopsided in their support for the Democratic Party, and they are to the tune of about 85 to 90%. What we don't often hear is that the majority of whites are Republicans, and that the last time a Democratic presidential candidate received a majority of the white vote was in 1964 with Lyndon
Ooh,
Johnson.
ooh.
So it's a heavily racialized society, and it maps onto our party system. And so therefore, the reason politicians craft racial messages, and by the way, it isn't just those nasty Republicans who do that. There are plenty of Democrats. If I have more time, I could talk about this, including the
Please.
last president of the United States, by the way, who
Mm.
also use racial appeals. They do it for one reason and one reason only, because it works.
Hmm. And then it presumably makes people think about it even more, and then thus more reactive to those sorts of messages in the future, right? It just heightens these divisions or these in-group out-group feelings, I would imagine.
Yes. In short, the Republican Party, at least since the 1960s, has sought to associate the Democratic Party with these disfavored racial minority groups. And the Democratic Party has sought to distance itself from those very same groups. So those,
Mm.
and so why do those individuals do that? Well, because these groups are disfavored. And so that's why they do it. And so one party is trying to associate that group with their opponents, and their opponents are trying to run away as fast as possible from that very group. They do try to court those votes as long as there aren't cameras around. But for the most part, they are trying to hold on. And the reason they do this, Andrea, and I know that we're running out of time here, but I'll just say in conclusion, the reason the Democratic Party, for example, does it is because they need to hold on to their dwindling support among the white electorate.
Mhm.
So as a consequence, they are loath to suggest that they are going to be responsive to the interests of the Black community or other minority communities. Sure, they want to put figureheads up there and they want to make symbolic overtures to that population, but they don't want to have to give up anything that will upset the current racial balance of power.
Am I understanding correctly that it's basically we've got both parties trying to keep the middle whites happy, and therefore necessarily, I mean, the Republican side is not interested in courting those votes, and the Democrats are not prioritizing or even actively distancing so that you don't lose that middle. Is that
Yes, yeah,
fair?
actively distancing. As I say, I could talk about this. My co-authors, who also are all from Michigan, who were at the time, Vanessa Cruz Nichols, Spencer Piston, and Legina Gauss. We just published a paper examining the ways in which Barack Obama used this very strategy in order to get elected in 2008. So again, it's easy to point to Trump and Republicans, and for good reason, because those parties do in fact engage in racially um, divisive strategies in order to gain electoral advantage. But so do the Democrats, including Barack Obama. And I can give you chapter and verse if I had more time to do so.
So we will get to something close to chapter and verse, or at minimum, I'll share out the link to the paper that's just released, and fantastic co-authors, of course. Let us bring Chinesha to the show. Speaking of Democrats and running for office and race and politics and all the rest, Chinesha, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for
How are
having
you?
me. I'm okay. All
Okay.
things considered, the world's on fire, that kind of stuff. I'm not
Yeah,
that bad.
not that bad. And you're in front of a fireplace that is not on fire, so
A decorative
pretty good.
fireplace that no longer can be on fire, so safety hazard.
Perfect. Well, safety first. So we left off talking about Democrats, shock among shocks, also not doing much to reach out to Black voters, Black Americans, Latino, Asian, etc. I'm so curious to hear about your experiences, both running for office and working on campaigns, working in politics. Let's start first with what office did you run for? What was it like? What is it like to run for office? It seems insane.
Well, I mean, let me preface this with I ran as a delegate to represent a candidate who was running for office, and so while that I totally have to run my own campaign and was a volunteer with that candidate's campaign, it's also very different from actually having to stump and all kinds of things. So, but
Your
in
name
that same
was on a ballot, which is extremely cool.
my name was on a ballot. So in that it is a legitimate election. I just don't have like a public elected office. So it's
Right.
the responsibilities are a little bit different. But the way in which I have to create a campaign, the way in which I have to create messaging in order to support the candidate and myself, very much the same thing. And I think the question was, what's that like? That it's like very anxiety inducing because you have to have a bit of an ego in order to kind of take on the process to begin with. But then there's the reality check of, well, what if no one actually votes for me? Or how do you actually snowball that into a campaign where you get a community to respond to? So there's a little bit of both things happening. But I think that with the campaign that I ran this go round, I was supporting a candidate. I was a delegate for, or at least I ran as a delegate for Elizabeth Warren. And so I was deeply committed to the platform that she was running on. And so it was very easy for me to advocate for that because, I was totally in alignment. So
I see. And out building on where we were speaking with Vince. So what was either your or the messaging that you did on behalf of the Warren campaign? What was the strategy, as far as you know, your own views around reaching out to, say, different racial or ethnic groups? Was it something that you were part of? Is it something that you thought about in your own campaign? What was that like?
For sure. Well, one of the things I'll say is that as a delegate, I don't just select myself. It's one of those things where you reach out to the campaign. The campaign decides who they want to run on behalf of them as a delegate, and then you have to go campaign and get onto the ballot. So there are a number of layers. You don't necessarily self-select to the extent where you can just like check a box and then go run. And the campaign has to choose folks that they want to represent them. So to a large degree, you know, I'm a person who has a platform as a person who works in media. I am generally active in my community. I do community organizing, and so I'm vocal in that way. But also, I'm a woman. I'm a Black woman. With clear proximity to whiteness, but I am a Black woman, and so that is an asset to the campaign in my district, which is Congressional District 8 in Brooklyn. So it's a strategic play to a great extent. The candidates, the folks that they want to represent the campaign, have to represent the values of the campaign. So in that way, my campaign was very much centered on my own personal politics and how I am represented, but also very strategically chosen by the campaign to go out and be that forward face. You kind of asked also about what Warren's campaign was like.
Mm-hmm.
And
are you on a first name basis with her, by the way?
We're besties. Me and Lizzie,
yeah.
we go way back. No, so personally, I can't really speak from a prescriptive point of view, so I won't really talk about what went wrong or right with the campaign. Right. But I do know that there were leadership in the campaign that were definitely persons of color, across the spectrum of sexuality and gender. But I think that there was definitely a challenge in communicating the message of the campaign and the intention of the campaign to those groups, to those person groups. It was, really easy to get, white voters to support Warren, progressive white voters. I think it was much more difficult, especially earlier on in the year, for, speaking candidly, particularly Black voters to communicate with the campaign, because I don't think they were fully aware of the extent to which Warren was prepared. And a lot of that messaging didn't come through in the debates. And if you ever went to one of her rallies, it was like a masterclass in how to run a campaign, but that really didn't translate to audiences that would more readily receive that information. So folks who might have casually tuned into the debates really weren't getting the extent to which that she was prepared to represent those communities, and those communities didn't have the same kind of buy-in to her campaign. So by the time that she suspended it, I think that her cohort wasn't necessarily as diverse as it would have needed to been to cross that finish line.
And do you think that was a deliberate, or not a deliberate, but do you think that was an oversight on behalf of the campaign, or they deliberately were like, we're not going to worry about making sure our messages resonate with these communities? Or maybe you?
No, I mean, to the extent that I wasn't involved in that, it's way above my pay grade. So I couldn't answer those kinds of like
your entire campaign strategy. Well, okay.
Me and Lizzie text sometimes, and I'm really disappointed that wasn't in part of our conversation.
You could text her now and ask her if you want.
Probably. I should, check in on her, see how she's doing.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I don't think it was an intentional way of dismissing those communities. As a matter of fact, the campaign did a lot of training for their volunteers where how do you communicate, how do you campaign, how do you advocate for Warren in these communities? So there was a really concerted effort to find languaging and messaging that would connect with those folks. I just don't know how successfully it was done, or the folks that were volunteering, how successfully that translated once they were out in the field.
Right.
I don't really know what happened, but there definitely was a gap between who they wanted to be supported and who they actually had on their team.
Vince, I'm gonna put you on the spot. I don't suppose you've got any working papers on the way about the Warren campaign's messaging around race, or?
I do not, but I was impressed for the most part by the messaging from I was impressed with the platform of Senator Warren.
Okay. Agreed. Yeah. I mean, that was one of the things that most attracted me when you went to the website, when you looked at really the in-depth plans that were prepared. I think that it was comprehensive in that it was really addressing systemic issues, and it wasn't just, hey, we need to police reform or we need to, fix climate change. It was really, how do we talk about environmental racism? How do we talk about the ways in which mass incarceration impacts other communities? Electoral politics are deeply connected to all of these things. And so I don't think there was none of these issues were really existing in a bubble. And I think because it's a lot of other campaigns can kind of whittle down to a great soundbite that's easily manipulated and pollinated across different platforms. To be in the Warren campaign was to be deeply set in like this really complex messaging that was not easily communicated in a soundbite. And I think that was the biggest disservice, that she was just too prepared in some way.
That is depressing. Yeah, I can think of, the I have a plan, and then lots of details that you can't really talk about on the stage.
Exactly. There's never enough time to really get into how do you fix the country, like legitimately fix the country. And it's not a 30-second or 2-minute soundbite. There are.
Yes, shockingly. Yeah. Guess we can't do it in 30 seconds. So I want to ask you also, so on this topic of racial attitudes, Vince, I'm gonna come back to you after I ask this next question to Chinesha. When you do either your political work or you do a lot of work in activism, organizing, turning social justice issues into media and productions that are consumed by others, how do you think about changing an audience member or a voter's racial attitude? Is that something you think about? Do you have a sense of what works, what doesn't, or whether you're able to change someone's underlying racial attitude?
I'm going to answer this like a politician.
Right. Perfect.
In the work that I do as a producer, I'm constantly personalizing my work and communicating my own individual story. And so any kind of, television, digital, film production that I'm working on has to already represent my values and kind of like my political moral center. And so if I can't do that, then it's not a project that I would engage in. But if I am communicating a message with an audience, or if, as I often find myself, I'm one of the only Black folks on a production or the only Black person on a production, my voice has to kind of check kind of white blind spots. And so there's sometimes subtleties in language that you want to correct for, or there are ways in which, you get context with like, oh, we'll show this image and we'll say this thing. And that some white folks who just don't understand how those two things might create messaging, even if they're not conscious of it. But, as a Black person, as an audience member, I will absolutely totally read that if I were to see that on screen. So I think that I think about that a lot when I'm creating work, like how would I receive this as an audience member? And I think if I'm reflecting that point of view, it might move the needle for other audience members because it's shifting the conversation and the tone and how we consume media. Because I think that a lot of folks who are behind the camera, who are producers, tend to be white men, and they live in a bubble and they don't have these kind of checks and balances on how they communicate messages. And so they're talking to other white dudes in the audience without really consideration for anyone else that's receiving it. So I think that with that the kind of you have to be in the room representation matters. That's exactly how it plays out, with having that voice behind the scenes that's constructing the message that then changes the audience perspective, whether they realize it or not.
Right. Vince, I'm curious, do you do research on people's racial attitudes changing, or persuasion? I'm not even sure if persuasion is the right verb for changing someone's racial attitude.
I don't focus on that per se, but I'm certainly aware of some other work in that regard. You won't be surprised to hear, I suspect, that it's not easy to persuade people in the domain of politics. And
what if I was like, oh, I had no idea. This is news to me. Yeah,
Give your PhD back, please.
Yeah.
When you throw in race, that just makes it all the more difficult.
Yes.
But not impossible. I don't want to. There certainly is hope for that. I see it with my students every year, so I do believe it's possible, but it's very difficult.
Okay. Do we have? Yeah, I'm curious. Other than having more voices and more perspectives on the messaging, whether it's the arts or political messaging itself, or what must help. But okay, Vince, I'm going to turn to audience questions in a moment, but I must hear about what Obama did.
So I teased this earlier. Yes, very briefly.
Yeah. Thank you for making our show suspenseful. It's very cool.
Third act reveal.
Yeah.
My co-authors and I mentioned them earlier. We did a study where we looked at a sample of the campaign ads that Obama ran in 2008, including the one that launched his general election campaign in the fall of 2008. And they were suspiciously and remarkably devoid of people of color, with the exception of himself. Indeed, the campaign launched itself with an ad called "The Country I Love," where he talked a lot about his family, that is to say, his grandparents and his mother, but not so much about his wife. Indeed, not about his wife or his daughters at all. So the point here is not to demonize any one candidate. The reason the candidates do these things is that, as I said earlier, because it works. So if I'm demonizing anyone, it's the electorate. But in short, what the Obama campaign did is leverage the fact that he is half white in order to make him seem more palatable to the American electorate. And in order to do that, he played up his white ancestry and he significantly played down his black ancestry. It's a controversial thing to say, but if you take a look at the article, you'll see that we do have some evidence for it.
And the article is called, so folks can find it, or if they Google you, they can find the article.
Yeah, I should remember. It's called you would think you put me on the spot here.
Yeah, sorry.
The title.
Yeah. Academic paper articles are impossible to remember.
I remembered my co-authors, but I couldn't remember the title because it's been so long. But basically, it was just if you Google my name and Obama, it should come up.
There it is. All right. So a couple of questions and also some great audience comments. We have Vanessa, who you shouted out before, is excited to hear about your work, Chinesha. That's awesome. We have a lot of folks saying that we're all indeed going to celebrate when racism is over. That's fantastic. Very good. We should continue this conversation into the town halls tonight. I will happily do that rather than watch the town halls. There, I said it. Okay, great. All right. So question, and I'll send it to both of you. So what role might reparations play in evening the social economic playing field? Do you think it would ever be politically possible? Janisha, you want to go first on this one? It's a tough one.
Sure. Give it to me again, just to make sure I'm not going to go off left field.
So would reparations be valuable in evening out the socioeconomic playing field? And is that something that's politically possible in this country?
Well, I mean, I don't. The question of like whether reparations would even the playing field. I don't know. I can't imagine what size of a check you'd send to every black person or a person of African descent in this country. What's the value of that would even the playing field? Especially when you have billionaires in this country who have amassed essentially all of the country's wealth. I don't quite know what that number would be. I think that reparations in the form of complete overhaul of the country, the end of systemic racism would be the kind of reparations that would be true socioeconomic change. So in that case, yes. Whether that's politically possible, it's probably far more possible to get real systemic change in this country without framing it as reparations. So you'll probably see, environmental change long before you see someone okaying a check to every black person in this country. Like, I just ideologically, there are whiteness and white supremacy in this country, whether it is conscious or subconscious, is so embedded in the structure of this country that I don't think that to frame it that way would ever be a winnable cause. Or, at least in the country that we are now, I think it's far easier to do other work than to do that. And that's I'm not taking a stance on whether or not reparations is a worthy pursuit. I just think that there are other things that are probably achievable way before reparations.
Mm-hmm. Vince, I'm curious, is this something that I don't know if it's asked about directly in the American National Election Study, but certainly questions about these sorts of policies or various policies, as you described, a lot of white respondents in your surveys have resistance to these. I mean, is there, what's politically feasible in your view?
Well, I'll answer that question and also answer a related question that you didn't ask, but I think that it's worth asking. We're
all politicians. This is great. Yeah, I love it.
So I think I agree with Chinesha, yes, Chinesha, that it is a tough sell in the current moment. Affirmative action, which is legal in this country, is remarkably unpopular among most whites. The last poll data I saw from California, where there's a ballot initiative to try to return it to its legal status, suggests that it is going down in flames. Now, I hope that they can turn that around, and maybe I'm wrong about that. But if in a state like California, which is dominated by Democrats, it is a tough sell to get affirmative action reinstated, then yeah, reparations is a tough sell. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't pursue it, because of course, if we all jump in our time machine and go back to the 19th century, abolition of slavery once looked like a pretty tough sell too. And I'll just say this without hogging the floor. Given the magnitude of the resource differential between people of color and whites, and it is massive. It isn't just that there's a 10-to-1 ratio in terms of median wealth between these two communities, but it is a difference on the order of about $160,000. So Shanisha was asking for a figure before. That's what the figure is.
That's a lot.
Good to know. I'll put that on my next contract request.
Yeah.
In order to address this problem, I'll just be blunt. We need something dramatic on the order of reparations. It will not be addressed by tinkering at the margins. If we really are serious about wanting racial equality, then we have to be serious about reparations, because anything short of that will not address the problem.
How can we get, and this is for both of you, candidates to advocate for such a thing if what they're still doing is, maybe I'm oversimplifying, drawing divisions between racial groups and courting the moderates? Like, right? You need a progressive vision in order to do this, but it seems like it's not strategically tenable for campaigns in the current day and age, right?
Yeah, I mean, speaking quite frankly, I think that candidate has to not center whiteness, which is what most candidates do. Like, their platform is to appeal to whiteness and to structure their entire campaign about how do I be the most moderate while still, appealing to my base. The only way in which to really move the needle in any of that is the huge, massive other half of the population that's increasingly becoming larger needs to be addressed. They're just needs that are not being hit.
Right. We have a note here from Vanessa that birtherism rumors are also plaguing Kamala Harris. So yes, that also is continuing for sure. A question from Ashley: has Trump set the stage for the Republican Party's latest race strategy for the foreseeable future? Are we going to see? We locked into this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's not obvious. The most likely scenario is that Trump will lose in November, barring, frankly, a miracle at this point. And so, therefore,
he likes miracles. So
yeah, well, he might get that miracle. The point is that this does not appear to be a winning strategy, nor is it really strategic, it seems to me, for Republicans to turn away voters if they don't have to. I think that one could embrace all the various values that Republicans typically prioritize, but without necessarily driving away suburban middle-class white women, and not to mention some fraction of people of color. There's a way to have your cake and eat it too, but the Trump strategy is not an expression of that.
What would that look like for Republicans going forward if they could?
It would look like George W. Bush in 2000 and 2004.
Okay.
I'm always kind of curious about that. How, I mean, the extremist base that they're appealing to is not as large as they might have hoped, and I don't see that being the temperature of the country as a whole. There's just not possible. And so I'm always curious, like, why is that the motivating factor? What other motivating factors are at play there?
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, one for the ages.
You asked a good one when even Vince is like, we don't know. We have no idea. That's a serious question. Question from Rob. What practical steps can average citizens take to make a dent in racial attitudes and inequities?
There's at least one thing I often indicate when I give various talks on these questions. So one thing is that people can do is to hold the candidates that they are already inclined to support, to hold those candidates accountable on the issues of race and inequality. It's easy to talk about the people who you already oppose and to say, yeah, those guys, those horrible Democrats or Republicans, they should stop doing X, Y, and Z. That is the definition of cheap talk. You weren't going to support those people anyway. But if you are really genuine about wanting racial equality, that's partly why I'm far more likely to level criticisms against the left, because I think it's more meaningful It
Yeah.
does, and so yeah, I've written more than a few papers. By the way, the title, it's about whitewashing.
Whitewashing.
So
Don't use that clip of me just shouting whitewashing and sharing how horrible is that.
what we call a senior moment, right? So I
Ooh,
know it comes
yeah,
to me, it just takes a while.
yeah.
But so I've written more than a few papers critical of Obama and Clinton and other Democrats, because that's where we should be critical. We should be critical of the people who we are presumably more ideologically compatible with. And so that would be one thing to do. The other thing is to be, we should all of us, no matter what your racial or class background, recognize that we have not gotten to where we are simply based on our own great talent and initiative. We have all benefited from the work of the people who came before us. So it isn't just about criticizing whites who benefit from all the wealth that they were able to amass from the previous generations, which they have, but it's also about people of color, myself and others. We also benefit. I mean, I'm sitting where I am today because of what my parents and my grandparents did for me. So I would hope that people would come to grips with that so they could be a bit more humble about their station in life and not so lacking in compassion.
Janisha, what about you? What thoughts about what sort of everyday folks can do to make a dent in either attitudes or the actual inequities that we're describing?
Oh, well, I absolutely agree with Vince that, I have a total brain fart. Oh my God, mid-sentence. It's
I'm really
dinner
causing
time.
people to black out today. That's probably all the tequila shots we did before the show. I got to stop doing that.
We pre-gamed. It's contagious.
Yeah.
We pre-gamed for this. Oh no, I totally agree. But I also feel like it starts within your own circle. So if you want to change attitudes first, you have to change your own, and then communicating those to those closest to you. I don't think that if you can't have those difficult dialogues with the folks in your own community, I find it really difficult to then try to bring that to other communities. You're far more likely to even have an audience with the folks that, the guy next door, the guy at the bodega, where do you get your lunch every day, your coworkers, and not to say that those are easy conversations, but they're the most accessible. And if you can move the needle even a degree or two there, they can then bring that conversation forward. It's far more difficult to think that you can, get a national platform and change folks' minds. People are very hard-lined. They're not going to change. But, there's some study that I'm sure someone can quote and find that white
None
folks
of us can, but yeah, someone.
No
can.
one here, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But white folks are much more inclined to change their racial attitudes about others when they have folks of color in their own personal life, because it personalizes them and humanizes them. So I think that direct empathy and individualizing the stories makes it much easier to move. And I think a lot of people are afraid of losing friends or alienating folks, but the risk reward there is much higher if you just do the work. So
right, yeah. So tough conversation starting locally is very powerful, and certainly more proactive than watching television and yelling about things, which is what I default to. So very good. So this actually is a good segue. We're going to wrap up. I have 2 lightning round questions for you both, but I want to actually flag that next week we're going to continue this conversation a bit, at least in terms of changing attitudes. We're going to talk about transforming prejudice towards the transgender community, LGBTQIA+ community, and we are going to have Melissa Mickelson, who I think is watching. Hey, Melissa, and Brian Harrison on to talk about their work on transforming prejudice next week. But before we go, I do like to ask every guest. We're doing our own poll here. Vince, you already alluded a little bit to what you think is going to happen. Who do you think is going to win in November? I just talked to you talked a big game compellingly about local politics, but let's go national. Who's going to win in November, and when will we know the results? Vince, what do you think?
Biden is certainly the favorite at this point, easily. And indeed, the question might be, is he going to win by a landslide or not? And we will likely know sooner after Election Day than people think, precisely because he's likely to win big.
Okay. All right.
I would warn folks not to get too comfortable, because this time 4 years ago, Clinton had a 10-point lead in the polls as well. So still go out and do your duty. And I hope that the margin is as wide as we expect it to be, so that we don't have to wait the 2 months plus to count voter mail-in ballots.
Very good. All right. Well, we have hit 8 o'clock, so I will wrap the show up there. Thank you both so much for joining us tonight. Chanisha, where can folks follow you, find out about what you're up to, and keep up with all that you're doing?
Sure. I'm easily stalkable on Instagram at just.chinisha, and I post most of my public life on there.
Yes, including a recent video that links to Instagram about your campaign experiences.
I jibber jabbered for 10 minutes about our electoral duty. So go watch it if you want to waste time.
A+. And Vince, what about you? Where can folks find your work and keep up with what you're up to?
You can go to the Political Science Department webpage at the University of Michigan, or the Center for Political Studies, also at the University of Michigan, and you'll find information about me there.
Those pages, by the way, should be everyone's homepage anyway. So head over there. And as a reminder, if you're able to donate, we are raising money for this show for the Equal Justice Initiative. And you can just send any amount over to this address right here, and we'll send it over tomorrow. And I will even show you a receipt so you know I'm not just pocketing it for myself. Speaking of reparations. Oh, God. Okay. All right. Well, thanks very much. I've been Andrea Jones-Rooy, Vincent Hutchings, Chanisha Scott. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.